Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Office Hours Politics Edition. I am your host, Sienna Ali, and Office Hours officially in session. I want to start this episode with a sentence that gets repeated constantly, usually by politicians, journalists, and international institutions. Sanctions are a peaceful alternative to war. The sentence sounds reasonable. It sounds humane. It sounds responsible. But today we are going to dismantle that. Slowly, carefully, and with receipts. Because today's episode argues something very specific. Sanctions are not an alternative thing to war. They are a modern form of siege warfare. They starve populations, they collapse health systems, they destroy infrastructure, and they shorten life expectancy. They do all of this without dropping a single bomb, which is exactly why they are politically useful. This episode is about how economic punishment replaced military occupation as the preferred tool of empire, and why civilians, not governments, always pay the price. Let's start with history. Siege warfare is one of the oldest forms of violence. Before drone strikes, before missiles, before tanks, you didn't need to invade a city to destroy it. You just needed to cut off food, water, medicine, trade. And then you waited. Sieges worked because they turned civilian survival into a weapon. Children starved first. The sick died early. Social order collapsed. And eventually the population broke. Not because they lost a battle, but because life became impossible. Now, here's the key question. What is the functional difference between a medieval siege and modern-day sanction regime? Because when you strip away the language, sanctions do the same thing. They restrict imports, they collapse currency, they block access to medicine, they prevent reconstruction, they isolate the economy. The only difference is optics. Sieges were visible. Sanctions are bureaucratic. Sanctions are sold to the public as targeted, smart, surgical, nonviolent. You'll often hear phrases like targeted sanctions, pressure on the regime, economic consequences. But here's the reality. There is no such thing as a civilian-free economy. When you sanction banks, people lose savings. When you sanction fuel, hospitals shut down. When you sanction imports, food prices spike. When you sanction currency, wages collapse. Sanctions don't float above society, they move through it. This is what political theorists call structural violence. Harm built into systems, not delivered by bullets. And the structural violence is hard to see, which makes it so much easier to justify. Here is why powerful states love sanctions. They allow governments to say, we're doing something without doing that. No body bags on TV, no soldiers coming home, no draft. Sanctions let leaders punish entire populations while maintaining the moral high ground. They function as moral laundering. Instead of saying we are intentionally harming civilians to force political change, they say we regret the humanitarian consequences, but responsibility lies with the sanctioned government. This language shift is crucial. Blame is displaced. Responsibility is outsourced. Violence is reframed as an unfortunate side effect. Here's one of the biggest lies about sanctions. They primarily hurt political elites. In reality, elites adapt, governments reroute resources, black markets emerge, the wealthy insulate themselves. It's ordinary people who suffer: workers, children, elderly, chronically ill, disabled populations. Sanctions don't collapse power, they restructure suffering. And they often make governments more authoritarian because scarcity gives the state more control over resources. So if sanctions were meant to produce democracy, the evidence shows the opposite. Under international law, punishment is illegal. You are not allowed to punish an entire population for the actions of its government. But sanctions do exactly that without soldiers on the ground. The logic is, if life becomes unbearable, the population will rise up. This is a deeply colonial assumption. It treats civilians as leverage, as pressure points, as tools. And historically, it has almost never worked the way sanction architects claim. Populations don't overthrow governments because of sanctions. They survive them at an enormous cost. This episode matters because sanctions are now one of the most widely used tools of global power. They are imposed by the United States, the European Union, Canada, and international institutions, often without UN authorization, democratic debate, and clear exit conditions. And once sanctions are imposed, they become permanent, normalized, invisible, forgotten. Which is why we need to talk about them. Not as diplomacy, not as morality, but as war by other means. Now let's talk about outcomes, because sanctions are often discussed in abstract terms. Pressure, signals, deterrence. But sanctions don't live in theory, they live in bodies. They live in empty pharmacies, darkened hospitals, rationed foods, collapsing currencies. So in this next part, we're going to go case by case, documenting history. Let's start with Iraq. Iraq in the 1990s. After Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, the United Nations, led overwhelmingly by U.S. pressure, imposed comprehensive sanctions. These sanctions blocked food imports, blocked medical equipment, spare parts for water treatment, froze assets, collapsed the currency. The result? Destruction of civilian life. UN agencies estimated that hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children died due to malnourished, preventable diseases, and the collapse of basic infrastructure. Hospitals had doctors but no supplies. Water plants existed but had no chlorine. Food existed but not affordable. And the key point is that these deaths were not accidental. They were predicted, they were documented, and they were accepted. In 1996, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright was asked on national television whether deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children were worth it. Her response? We think the price is worth it. That wasn't a slip. That was policy clarity. Sanctions were doing exactly what they were designed to do: make civilian life unbearable, thus kill. Iraq matters because it shattered the myth that sanctions are humane. After Iraq, policymakers didn't stop using sanctions, they just changed the language. Comprehensive sanctions became targeted sanctions. Collective punishment became pressure. But the core logic remained. Civilian suffering is acceptable leverage. Now let's talk about Cuba. Cuba has been under U.S. sanctions for over 60 years. Not because of war, not because of invasion, but because Cuba chose to nationalize industries. Do not align with the foreign policy of America. Create a political system hostile to U.S. control. The embargo has restricted food imports, medicine, medical equipment, fuel, financial transactions. Even when Cuba can buy supplies, sanctions made payments systems nearly impossible. The result? Chronic shortages, blackouts, rationing, economic isolation. And despite overwhelming international opposition, the embargo continues. Every year, the United General Assembly votes overwhelmingly to condemn it, and every year the U.S. votes no, Israel votes no, and everyone else votes yes. This is not democracy, that is power. Cuba shows us something crucial. Sanctions don't need to work to persist. They become permanent punishment, a form of containment, a warning to others, saying this is what happens when you step outside of the system. Now let's talk about Iran. Iran is often cited as an example of smart sanctions. You'll hear humanitarian goods are exempt, medicine isn't sanctioned, and this is where reality diverges from rhetoric. Because even if medicine is technically exempt, banks won't process payments, shipping companies won't deliver, insurance won't transport, so medicine becomes theoretical. During peak sanctions, cancer drugs were unavailable, treatments for rare diseases disappeared, hospitals rationed supplies. Children with chronic illnesses suffered disproportionately, not because Iran lacked doctors, not because Iran lacked money, but because sanctions serve the system. Sanctions don't need to ban medicine directly, they just need to make it impossible to move. Iran also shows how sanctions evolved. Modern sanction targets banking systems, currency access, international finance. This is siege warfare at a global scale. Instead of surrounding a city, you surround a country's access to money. And money in a global economy is survival. Now let's talk about Venezuela. Venezuela had serious internal problems. Corruption, mismanagement, dependency on oil. Sanction didn't create those problems, but they weaponized it. U.S. sanctions targeted oil exports, froze assets, blocked refinancing, restricted imports, studied Studies later showed that sanctions dramatically worsened food shortages, medical scarcity, inflation. And again, this wasn't denied. Officials openly stated sanctions were meant to increase pressure on the population, which brings us back to siege logic. Make life unbearable, hope the government collapses, accept civilian suffering as collateral. And finally, we need to talk about Gaza, which is one of the clearest examples of sanctions as siege warfare. Blockage restricts food, fuel, medicine, construction materials movement. Officials have openly described the goal of keeping the population on a diet, not starving, but never thriving. They are starving. This is sanction logic stripped of euphemism. A population deliberately kept at the edge of survival. This is not pressure on the government. What government? This is pressure. This is collective punishment. Across every case, a pattern is the same. A country challenges a dominant power, sanctions are imposed, civilian life collapses, elites adapt, the population suffers, the policy continues. Sanctions don't shorten conflicts, they prolong suffering. Why sanctions are politically perfect? Sanctions are ideal policy for liberal states because they offer all appearance of action with none of domestic cost. Again, as we were talking about earlier, no soldiers are deployed, no draft, no mass protest. Politicians say we took decisive action, we held them accountable, we stood for international norms. Sanctions function as performative strength. They allow leaders to look tough without risking political backlash. And that's why sanctions are almost always the first response and never the last. Now let's talk about the media, because sanctions don't work without narrative management. Notice how sanctions are reported: economic pressure, financial restrictions, targeted measures. You almost never see hospitals without medicine, children missing chemotherapy, water supplies collapsing. Civilian suffering is framed as unfortunate, indirect, and the responsibility of the sanctioned government. And this framing is crucial. It allows journalists to talk about sanctions without showing bodies. War images provoke outrage. Sanctions produce spreadsheets, and a spreadsheet doesn't trend. This is what makes sanctions uniquely dangerous. They kill slowly and invisibly. And you'll often hear officials say humanitarian goods are exempt. This is technically true and practically meaningless. Because exemptions don't matter if banks refuse transactions. Shipping companies won't insure cargo. Suppliers fear secondary sanctions. So food and medicine exist in theory, again, not in practice. Now let's talk about Canada. Canada loves to present itself as neutral, humanitarian actor, but Canada is deeply embedded in sanction regimes. Canada has imposed sanctions on Iran, Venezuela, Russia, Afghanistan, and Palestine. Often these sanctions mirror U.S. policy, exceed UN requirements, and lack democratic debate. And yet, Canada rarely discusses the humanitarian cost. Why? Because sanctions allow Canada to align with U.S. power without appearing violent. They fit perfectly into the Canadian self-image of polite, rule-based, and moral. But the outcomes are the same. Now let's talk about why sanctions never end. Sanctions are easy to impose, but politically difficult to remove. Lifting sanctions is framed as weak and a moral failure. So sanctions persist long after their stated goals are abandoned. They become background punishment, normalized suffering, permanent siege. And this is why countries like Cuba, Iran, and Palestine live under generational sanctions. Children are born into punishment that they had no role in creating. And if sanctions were treated honestly, accountability would require humanitarian impact assessments, sunset clauses, civilian protection mechanisms, reparations for harms caused. But none of that exists, because if sanctions were held to the same standards as war, they would fail every single test. So instead, we maintain the fiction. They're humane, they're necessary, they're temporary. Bring it all together. Sanctions encircle economies instead of cities. They starve populations instead of armies. They punish civilians instead of leaders. They are siege warfare adapted to a globalized war. And the reason they persist is simple. They allow powerful states to exercise dominance without taking responsibility. Super simple. That's what the West loves. So next time you hear a politician say, sanctions are a peaceful alternative to war, ask peaceful for whom? Violent for whom? Who gets to decide? Because if history showed us clearly, sanctions don't replace war, they reallocate it into kitchens, hospitals, and childhoods. This has been this week's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed, like, comment. Let's chit-chat about it. Until next week, stay curious, stay politically aware, and never confuse economic punishment with peace. Bye, guys.
Thank you.